guest today is Lauren Silver, a graduate student at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, who has been investigating the money laundering and sanctions violations of HSBC, one of the world's biggest banks. So, Lauren, can you begin by telling us a little bit about HSBC and where is it based exactly?
Well, HSBC, really Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, is one of the largest financial institutions in the world, with a couple of $1 trillion in assets. They recorded $22 billion in assets, or in profits, in 2012. Headquartered in London and called HSBC Group, it sits at the head of 5 regional sections: North America, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and Asian Pacific. There are at least 80 affiliate branches of HSBC, like HSBC Mexico or HSBC Middle East, and those branches have correspondent accounts with U.S. affiliates in order to gain access to the U.S. dollar or entry into the formal U.S. economic system.
What do you mean by correspondent accounts?
It's when one affiliate bank opens up an account with another affiliate bank in order to complete transactions in a jurisdiction where they don't have a physical presence. But it's not just these correspondent accounts that got HSBC into trouble. HSBC has correspondent relationship with lots of other banks and non-bank financial institutions like money exchange houses or Western Unions.
So why did the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations hearings decide to investigate HSBC?
Those hearings were looking into how and if HSBC's actions or anti-money laundering deficiencies resulted in opening up the U.S. financial system to money laundering, drug trafficking, and terrorism financing. They discovered that yes, HSBC Group and certain affiliates had serious AML deficiencies, and this led to laundered drug money entering the U.S. financial system, facilitated drug trafficking, possibly terrorism financing, and there were numerous sanctions violations. When looking at all the available information, there were 3 primary areas of concern: bulk cash shipments and smuggling of cash, trade with Iran and sanctioned countries, and a serious lack of anti-money laundering due diligence, especially in particular branches and departments.
What do you mean by bulk cash shipments and bulk cash smuggling?
Bulk cash shipments occur when one bank sends, either through a purchase or an exchange, a large shipment of U.S. dollars to another bank. Bulk cash smuggling is the illegal movement of dirty money across a border and smuggled into a country to then be exchanged and deposited. In the case of HSBC Mexico, they were found to be moving a huge amount of U.S. dollars, both through shipments, purchasing, and clearing. One of the basic schemes involved drug profits from the U.S., which were then smuggled in bulk into Mexico, then deposited either into small banks who had correspondent bank accounts with HSBC Mexico, or deposited into banks with their shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, or in some cases they were deposited directly in HSBC Mexico, who with a correspondent account with HBUS would then wire transfer the money into a U.S. branch and then wire out the funds to another account outside the U.S.
Now wait a minute. I thought Mexico set up new laws in the past couple of years preventing large cash deposits.
Well, when the Mexican banking system stopped allowing the deposit of huge amounts of U.S. dollars into their banks, the drug cartels caught on. And instead, they went to money service businesses called Casa de Cambios, which are essentially exchange houses with little or no enforced regulations. There, they would exchange the dollars into pesos, then have the pesos wired to HSBC Mexico, which would either buy U.S. dollars from HSBC in the U.S. and exchange the pesos for dollars for the client, or directly exchange the pesos for dollars and then act as the conduit to enter into the U.S. banking sector. Again, that money was often wired out of the U.S., sometimes back to Mexico or to the Cayman Islands, etc., to other bank accounts all over the world.
So the MSBs, it sounds like, were the weak link in the chain.
One of several weak links. There were 2 major MSBs investigated by the Permanent Subcommittee: the Casa de Cambia Puebla and the U.S.-based Sigway. Most of the suspicious cases had connections to Puebla, which came under scrutiny with the Wachovia scandal. Even after Wachovia, HSBC Mexico continued to do business with Puebla. Sigway, meanwhile, was located in California, but a client of HSBC Mexico. they would ship smuggled US dollars to HSBC Mexico to then be wired to HSBC in the US. In just 1 year, HSBC Mexico sent $7 billion in bulk cash shipments to the US. This number was so astronomical, especially in comparison to the sum of all other US dollar transactions that the US branch was having with the 4 large Mexican banks in total during the same period of time, that drug money had to have been involved.
What about the sanctions violations?
Well, the sanctions go back at least a decade. Countries like Cuba, North Korea, Sudan, Syria, and Iran held client accounts with various HSBC affiliates and used these accounts to gain access to the US dollar and the global or US financial system. They were actively courting Iranian banks, businesses, and clients, despite the pressure growing in the international community and the sanctions that were developing. There were emails between HSBC executives in Europe and the Middle East deliberately instructing subordinates and the company in general to pursue business in Iran. There were also a number of emails and memos discussing plans on how to circumvent the sanctions by slipping through OFAC's filter. They decided to remove any and all references to Iran, Iranian banks, and individuals or businesses on the transfer documents, and in its place would put innocuous words like self, or one of our clients, or do not mention our name in New York on the receiving party section of the documents. They were deliberately trying to deceive HSBC in the US, and of course OFAC, as to the involvement of these Iranian clients, including Iranian governmental entities, and the large volume of U-turn transactions that were occurring.
What are U-turn transactions?
They're wire transfers between 2 or more banks. For example, in the case of the Iranian client accounts in the Middle East, they were wire transferring funds from those banks into either Europe or the US, where they would be cleared as US dollars and then wired back out of the country. These U-turn transactions were being stripped of information and covered by being passed as legitimate transaction between 2 banks.
What were some of the other egregious violations?
Well, there was the case of Al-Rajhi Bank in Saudi Arabia, which HSBC had correspondent accounts with. The problem was that there were known or easily discoverable terrorism links between owners, founders, and executives of the bank and Islamist jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and a great deal of questionable activities by the bank that were just simply ignored. It appears that a culture of willful blindness existed within the bank's upper management, especially in particular regions like Mexico or the Middle East. There was a tone at the top that encouraged increased business and higher profit margins, even if that meant a complete disregard for international and U.S. anti-money laundering standards. But perhaps the most egregious offense was the lack of communication between branches and the parent corporation, and a ridiculous amount of turnover in the compliance department. There were emails between executives and senior officers that showed that there were concerns that were never dealt with or even checked up on, and there was a complete disconnect between what was occurring at HSBC's affiliates and what the HSBC group in London knew about.
You mentioned high turnover in the compliance department. Were people fired for enforcing regulations or asking too many questions?
Yes. Within 4 years, HSBC in the U.S. had 4 different directors of compliance and 5 new heads of the anti-money laundering department. 2 were fired after expressing concerns about how low AML standards there were. 1 resigned after a year, less than a year actually, because of a lack of support. And 2 were let go after negative critiques from the Federal Reserve.
So what can HSBC and the banking sector in general learn from this story?
The due diligence and active Know Your Customer programs are essential to AML compliance standards and needs to be the first line of defense, and is the key to avoiding incredibly embarrassing and potentially devastating investigations and fines. It's very likely that the fine levied against HSBC will be more than $1.5 billion. It's also essential that knowing your employees is incredibly important. Proper AML training is necessary, as is creating a culture from the top down that compliance is key. Communication between branches, executives, and departments need to be improved, and perhaps most important with regard to ensuring national security, and the bank security for that matter, is that the easiest access point to the formal financial system is through these correspondent accounts, especially the secondary correspondent accounts between smaller banks and major affiliates.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Silver, for being with us today. This has been incredibly informative.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.